Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Sara Patterson. She's going to tell us more about the untold story about David Wright. We'll also talk about some other BYU professors who were denied tenure due to their academic teachings. And so Sara is the author of the September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism, so you'll definitely want to get this book and put it on the tree for those Mormon history lovers you have. So check out our conversation. One of the other things that I thought was very interesting about your book, you felt like it should be more than just 6. And maybe we should mention who the 6 are, and then who are the other people that you think should be added into those 6 or 8 or 10 or 12?
Yeah. Sure. The 6 are Lynn Whitesides, Avraham Gileadi, Paul Toscano, Maxine Hanks, Lavina Fielding Anderson, and Mike Quinn.
Oh, very good. I always stumble over those, so very, very good.
And I think that part of what I'm trying to argue in the book is that the idea of the September 6th kind of locks us into a particular narrative, and that we need to look more expansively beyond that month to see a decades-long process within the church to try to pull people towards an orthodoxy and a unity. And so there are certainly others that I focus on in the book. David Wright is one of them. He was excommunicated about 6 months after the September 6th, and wondered if he was originally supposed to be part of that group, and then because of kind of individual circumstances, it was delayed.
And he's a former BYU professor as well, right?
That's right. He was a...
His story isn't very well known, I don't think.
No, it isn't. When I interviewed him, one of the things he said is, I usually only merit one sentence in discussions about the September 6th. And so would you like me to talk
Well,
a
he
little
was
bit?
your introduction, basically.
He was my introduction, in part because I wanted to start the book outside of the month, just to begin by disrupting the stories that people normally tell about that month. He was a biblical studies professor, and he initially in his career wanted to be the next Hugh Nibley. So he was going to be, when he set out, a defender of the faith and an apologist for the church. And over the course of his studies, and he talked about for a long time trying to avoid this, but came to believe that Mormon scriptures weren't historical documents or weren't ancient texts. And so what he was trying to do was embrace the method of historical criticism, and also see in the text a broader meaning. So he was trying to create a faithful approach to the scriptures that didn't rely on the historicity of the texts. And he got a lot of pushback for that and was eventually excommunicated. One of the stories that really struck me in his own experiences, he could tell that his interactions with his bishop and stake president weren't going anywhere. But he really wanted to participate in the baptism of one of his sons and the ordination into the Aaronic priesthood of another son. And so he was trying to kind of delay what he felt was the inevitable. And they eventually decided that he couldn't participate in those sacraments. He had to stand off to the side. And he talked about how hard that was for him, especially as part of a family that had generations of Mormons in it, to be kind of sidelined from these really important events in his son's lives. And so, yes, I start the book with him to try to upset the September 6th framing right from the beginning. And I think that some of the people at BYU who were disciplined during that same time period are important to think about. Ultimately, I would say I wouldn't choose another number.
I wanted to get a number out of you.
I appreciate that, but I think I would just, I think that we need to look at the disciplining of a number of people kind of more broadly, and disciplining in different ways. So not all excommunications, but some people losing their positions at BYU, some people just being called in over and over again for their scholarship by their local bishops and stake presidents. Yeah.
Can you talk about some of those people? David Knowlton, I think, is one of them.
Sure. David Knowlton was a professor at BYU, along with Ceclia Conchar Farr and Gail Houston. And all three of them in 1992 were up for review and for their teaching positions. And the question was whether they would have continuing status. And
which is like tenure in a way?
The closest to tenure that you can get at BYU.
Right.
Yeah. And all three of them were denied continuing status, and so had one more year in their positions, and then asked to leave.
And maybe for those who aren't in academia, like you and I, they might not understand why tenure is a good thing, or at least from a academic point of view. Let's talk a little bit about tenure and how that's a little bit different at BYU.
Sure. So tenure exists to help protect the academic freedom of intellectuals so that institutions can't punish them for the questions that they're asking or the research that they're doing. And so that doesn't exist at BYU, I think because it's a religious institution. And so the idea of academic freedom has always been more complicated at BYU because it's a religious institution. And so I think it's clear that at various times at BYU, there have been limitations on the questions that people could ask or the research that they would be able to do. So Knowlton, the focus in Knowlton's case was tied to his research, and for Farr, it really revolved around her participation in a pro-choice rally in Salt Lake City, where she stood up and said, "I'm a Mormon and I'm pro-choice," and she. I think really interestingly, she had been asked by a student in one of her classes to participate in this rally. And she understood that that could be a controversial thing. And she also understood why it could be a powerful thing to have a BYU professor say that she was pro-choice. And so she went to her bishop and stake president and told them, here's what I am planning on doing, and this is the speech that I'm going to give. And you know me, and you know that I'm a faithful person. And they both said, okay. And so she went off and participated in the rally. And then the backlash that she received was at BYU. She never was excommunicated.
Okay.
Because at least the way that she talks about it is that the bishop and the stake president defended her and refused to do anything because they had this exchange about what she was going to do, and because they knew that she was a faithful person and that she saw this as an important stance to take. And so in my interview with her, she talked about how it was two men who stood between her and excommunication, which is I think a really powerful statement, that she was just, even 30 years later, she remembered that as a really meaningful thing, that they didn't attempt to discipline her.
Did she have any indication that, I guess, the higher-ups wanted to have her excommunicated?
Well, I think what happened at BYU at least indicated to her that what she had done was seen as a problem.
Okay.
She was called in after the rally by her department chair, and she remembers that part of what they were talking about was whether or not BYU should or could say what a faculty member should talk about when they're off campus. Yeah. And the department chair said that she should not speak again about the issues. And then when there was a feminist newspaper in Salt Lake City that asked to republish her speech, and she agreed to that, the department chair took that as her choosing to speak again, basically.
Oh, okay.
On the topic. And so, it was complicated because then there's the academic review process. And so some of what was happening was framed as her, that her scholarship wasn't up to the standards of the school.
Meaning it was too political? Or, I mean, is it one of those things where they're like, well, your scholarship's not really good, but it was fine, and it really was a cover for her politics? Yes,
the latter.
Okay.
And she ended up suing BYU, and so there was a legal settlement. But
so it sounds like she won the legal settlement, even if she lost her job.
That's right. And so yeah, these cases are all really complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue of academic freedom is a really complicated issue on BYU's campus. Yeah. So
is this a case with David Knowlton, Ceclia Farr? Wasn't there a Robert Rees as well? I'm trying to remember. You said
at the same
name.
time, Gail Houston.
Gail Houston.
Yeah.
Is this a case where, well, we won't go after your membership, we'll just go after your paycheck? Whereas they didn't really, because we haven't talked about Margaret and Paul Toscano yet. Margaret's kind of, I joked with her, are you 6.5 or 7?
Yeah.
Because she was really in the thick of that too, but she wasn't a BYU employee, I don't believe.
No, she was not. Oh, wait.
She did teach adjunct, I guess.
That's right. She was not.
But I know by the year,
yeah,
we're jumping ahead in the story a little bit, because she didn't get excommunicated until 2000. She got in trouble in 93 with the rest. But because she continued to publish and they couldn't do anything about her job, is that why they went after her membership? Could we look at it that way?
Oh, that's interesting. I think that I think part of the reason that the BYU professors were disciplined is that BYU has been imagined as a place of believers building Zion as like an example for the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And so there's been an impulse, I think, from the administration to want it to be the best example of orthodoxy, and to want it to be kind of a unified message about, to have the campus present a unified message about what being a faithful person looks like. And so I think that was the danger with these faculty people, because they were suggesting that they could be faithful and have other ideas and do other things than what was expected of them. And so I
mean, it's interesting because Michael Quinn worked at BYU, was fired from BYU, and got excommunicated. So he got everything.
He wasn't fired from BYU. He resigned.
Well, he resigned. Yeah, but resigned under pressure.
He definitely saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he had reached, and I don't know the status at BYU, but the equivalent of tenured status at BYU.
Right.
And so, but that didn't protect him when he wrote about women holding the priesthood in 1843. I know that was one of the articles that was cited in his excommunication.
That came out after he left.
Oh, was
BYU.
that after?
Yeah, he left BYU in 88, and that came out in 93.
Okay. So it's interesting, because, I always wonder, Lynn Whitesides is another one. She was disfellowshipped, never excommunicated.
Yeah.
And I even asked her, I'm like, they went after Margaret, 7 years later. Why are you still a member? I mean, she doesn't go to church. She's not.
Right.
I wouldn't even call her a believer at all.
Right.
Whereas Margaret still is.
Well, I think Lynn's a different type of believer. She's moved away from the church.
Yeah,
totally.
She's moved away from Christianity.
Yeah. And I think she fairly quickly came to view her disfellowshipment as freedom or liberation.
Yeah, she definitely did.
And felt like she found a much more fulfilling spiritual life outside of the institution. Yeah.
So it's just interesting. Quinn he resigned from his job, but under pressure. So I'm going to say, to me, I treat that as a loss.
Okay.
Then he was excommunicated. They went after Margaret. They went after Janice Allred, who we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
And I think you've included her in kind of the September group, the broader picture.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how Ceclia Farr, David Knowlton are still members, and it was just going after their job good enough, or why haven't they been excommunicated as well? I guess is my question. Why did they go after David Wright and not, and Michael Quinn and not some of these others? Do you have any insight into that?
I would be hypothesizing, of course.
We can do that. This is Gospel Tangents. I know the historians don't like to do that, but I do. I like it when you do. That always makes
me anxious when people say, could it have happened differently? I always think, I don't know.
It's called Monday Morning Quarterback.
Cecilia left Utah and found another position. And she left with her temple recommend in her hand. And so, and she stayed in the church for quite some time. In fact, it wasn't until her children were struggling with some of the messages in the church that she decided to stop attending church.
Okay.
But perhaps it has to do with her moving away from those centers of orthodoxy. She moved to the Midwest, and so she talked about feeling like it initially, when people still remembered who she was in terms of the BYU story, that women would ask her questions, and she felt like they were trying to feel out, like, where's the line so that I make sure that I don't cross it. But I think moving away helps, right?
Okay.
So
it didn't help Kate Kelly, but that's beyond.
Okay. See, this is why I don't do hypothetical stuff. I'm forgetting who else you included in your question.
One person that I'm not as familiar with that you had mentioned was Gail Houston. Let's learn more about her story.
I don't know a whole lot about it. It wasn't a story that I focused on in the book, but she also was involved with feminist issues on campus, and I believe that was what the issue was. Okay,
and she was pretty good friends with Cecilia?
They were. They both worked with Voice, which was a feminist student group, and Voice was quite active on BYU's campus and was receiving a lot of pushback. And so I think that what they were doing was seen as kind of a lightning rod activist group on campus.
And we don't do activism in the church.
Well, yeah, one of the issues that they were talking about at that time was assault on BYU's campus.
Sexual assault.
And a lot of people, it's clear from letters to the editor, they had a flyer that was meant to be ironic. There was a woman who was attacked on campus one morning at, 10 in the morning, and managed to, I think she was beat up a little bit, but managed to get away from the attacker. And in response, they made a flyer that said, starting immediately, there's going to be a curfew for men on BYU's campus. And I don't know, it was 10 p.m. or something. And after that time, men need to walk with at least 2 women if they're going to be out, to show that they're not a threat to anybody. And people really responded negatively to that. I think that they failed to see what they were trying to communicate, which was that women often don't feel safe on campus and feel like they need to travel in groups. But in letters to the editor about that, it's very clear, this goes back to this idea that BYU's a special place. And so it's very clear that people were, any kind of assault that was happening on the campus was outsiders coming onto the campus and
Not
assaulting
insiders.
people. Yes. And so people were just very reluctant to even entertain the idea that assault might happen, student-on-student assault might happen. And so, yeah, I think that's tied to kind of how people want to imagine BYU.
Well, and I know BYU, it seems like, if I remember right, when Elder Holland was president of BYU, he wanted to make it Harvard of the West. But there's some problems with that. Harvard allows Jewish scholars, Catholic scholars, Protestant scholars. BYU doesn't. You have to be LDS. Well, I won't say you have to be, but they don't have a Jewish scholar teaching Judaism. They don't have a Methodist scholar teaching Methodism. That's against the rules. And so, doesn't it seem like there's a conflict with being the Harvard of the West when we're not really acting like Harvard or Notre Dame or some of these other schools that allow non-Catholic faculty, for example, at Notre Dame, to teach Judaism or Islam or Methodism or whatever. Can you talk about that tension at BYU?
Well, I think David Wright is an interesting example of that, because it was because of Holland's statement about the Harvard of the West that he decided to go to BYU. He had several job offers, and he thought, if I can go to BYU and do this scholarship that is, historical criticism was just part of scriptural studies. He was not at all radical or cutting edge in terms of what he was saying about scripture and how it should be read.
But he was radical at
BYU. And so when he got there, he kind of quickly realized that he was not able to have the conversations that he wanted to have. He talked about wanting to host a discussion of differences between creation stories. And the response he got from his department members was, don't point out to people that there are differences in the creation stories, because, if they don't know that, then you don't want to introduce to them something that might become a problem for their faith. And so So yes, I think it's not just tied to different faiths kind of teaching their own perspectives, but it's also about what questions you're able to ask. And I think he didn't realize that people were going to perceive kind of at a basic level, in introductory biblical studies classes, you learn that there are differences in the creation stories at secular universities all around the country. So it wasn't something that, was radical, as you said.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Sara Patterson, the author of The September 6 and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism. So make sure you get this book and put it on the Christmas tree for your Mormon history lovers. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about her view of an expanded September 6, which will include people like Sonia Johnson, Brent Metcalf, and perhaps Mark Hoffman.
Sonia Johnson was a church member who fought for the Equal Rights Amendment. And she talked about the Equal Rights Amendment. When she first heard that phrase, Equal Rights Amendment, she said something like, the three most beautiful words in the English language. So she really felt like the ERA was an important issue and that it didn't contradict her faith. And so she was an activist for the ERA. She was one of the founders of Mormons for the ERA. And she was eventually excommunicated for that work.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe on either Patreon or at gospeltangents.com. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire audio uninterrupted. On our $10 tier, if you would like to see the whole video, you can see that either on youtube.com/gospeltangents, or I've got a special Facebook group devoted for full videos. So subscribe at gospeltangents.com and sign up for just $10 a month. For $20 a month, if you'd like to get some bonus content, maybe some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor, you can sign up for that. And then if you'd like to talk to me for $100 a month, we'll do a monthly phone call on something like Zoom, and you can ask me anything you want. So thanks again. Also, don't forget about the merch, mugs, t-shirts, hats, things like that. I'm trying to get the ties up there. Hopefully I can get up there. And thanks again for watching Gospel Tangents, and click here for some more videos.